40 years ago, Britain was poised on the brink of an extraordinary discovery, which, it seemed, would change the country's fortunes forever. Oil. Billions of gallons of it, deep beneath the North Sea, promised to kickstart our ailing post-war economy. This is the story of an extraordinary human endeavour, of men and women who brought about a technical and financial revolution. (1979), and the latest oil field in the North Sea is poised to come on stream.
No longer cold steel, the platform pulses into life. From 2 miles under the earth, the oil begins to flow.
120 miles northeast of Shetland, hundreds of people are working around the clock, 365 days a year, pumping a non-stop flow of oil. Britain was on the brink of self-sufficiency in oil, and a new chapter in the country's history was about to begin. 15 years since it began, the North Sea oil industry now boasts over 20 platforms and a workforce of over 20,000 in the remotest workplace in Britain. Workers swap their Cortinas and Allegros for Chinooks and Sikorskis for the long commute to work.
The first time I went offshore, I was very excited, just full of anticipation, and the flight and the smells, the smell in the helicopter.
A mixture of stale alcohol, sweat, bad breath, heli fuel, which is pretty noxious as well.
There I was, enrolled, taken up to Aberdeen, and within a fortnight I was offshore on the first jacket platform. And that's really where the adventure all started for me. I actually couldn't believe that I was in the middle of the North Sea and all this fresh air was around me as well.
35,000 trips a year made the heliport in Aberdeen the world's busiest.
The helicopter landing deck in the middle of the sea is just a pinprick of light at a distance in a complete sea of darkness.
The difficulties come when it's the miserable night and you've got heavy rain and everything's being distorted through the windscreen, and you are trying to make this approach to a deck that isn't an awful lot bigger than the size of your helicopter. That's when you have to work for your living.
My very first journey offshore was in 1980.
The men who worked on this platform used to be amongst the most isolated in the UK.
I remember being so incredibly excited that I was actually going to see this thing that I'd been reporting on from land. I was going to see what it was actually like.
I can remember the helicopter circling the platform as they do before they come into land, and it was like being in a Mad Max movie. This extraordinary industrial object, this city that's floating there with sort of smoke and steam belching out of it.
And of course, platforms are enormous. You come down on one in a helicopter on that helipad, take my word for it, you swear you are landing on a postage stamp in the middle of nowhere. Oh gosh, it was exciting. It was so exciting.
The colossal platforms were hugely productive. North Sea oil was pouring £5 billion into the national coffers, but in the rest of the country, industry was stagnant. Before 1979, the country hadn't earned a penny in tax from the oil bonanza. The oil companies had spent billions on development and exploration. They were allowed to recoup their investment before paying any tax. As the 80s dawned, the money started to roll in. Billions of pounds of tax fell into the hands of Britain's new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. She had revolutionary ideas and the will to impose them.
The Russians said that I was an iron lady.
Yeah.
They were right. Britain needs an iron lady.
With a little help from North Sea oil, Margaret Thatcher was about to start a revolution, one which would change Britain forever.
I have a letter from one of the senior officials of the Treasury, wrote to me at that time, saying this is the most radical government he'd ever seen in his lifetime. Radical in the sense of a departure from what had gone before.
The Conservatives hoped the dynamism of the oil industry would pull the country out of recession. Elsewhere, unemployment was rising steeply. The Social Security bill alone was immense. But oil revenues would bankroll the transformation of our economy.
Along came this wonderful asset, that revenues from which were, by the standards of those days, huge. So they were a huge additional source of revenue to any government.
And the value of that revenue was directly tied to the price of oil on world markets. In 1979, revolution in Iran and the war that followed with Iraq sent panic through financial markets, and the price of oil rocketed. As the Iranian oil fields burnt, the price of oil more than doubled. The impact on the North Sea was immediate.
We knew that with the price going up, there were obviously going to be bad spin-offs as well as good spin-offs. And one of the good spin-offs was, we were told by the industry, was that it was going to make hitherto uneconomic fields suddenly economic, so that we were going to see more rigs going out to explore, we were going to see more platforms being built.
Unemployment may have been rising in the rest of the country, but in the oil industry, thousands of new jobs were being created.
The work prospects in the oil industry then were almost limitless. There were 3 or 4 rig yards in Scotland, and offshore, 4 big oil fields were under construction. And for about 5 or 6 years, it was a fairly hectic and busy time.
You'd work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, sometimes for 6 or more weeks at a time. You witnessed, a great deal of hard partying. And, of course you look forward to it. The moment that you got ashore, what you wanted to do was head to a bar.
New oil workers and new money transformed the fortunes of Scotland's oil capital, Aberdeen.
As a result of the oil boom, house prices and rents in Aberdeen are now reckoned to be as high as London.
There was quite a buzz about the place. Hotels were full, new flights were set up, shops were doing extremely well.
Black gold is much in evidence at the docks of Europe's offshore capital. The residents don't say, "Tanks for the memory" anymore. That's progress, I suppose. Oil has become a way of life here.
Even fishermen got a boost as trawlers were converted into safety vessels to patrol the offshore platforms.
All the way up to the north of Scotland, there were oil terminals being built. There were platforms being built in the Moray Firth at Nig and at Ardasir, and there were platforms being built on the west coast at Kishorn as well. Now, all this meant that suddenly there were new orders coming in, millions and millions of pounds worth of orders coming in.
And it was private oil companies that were doing the spending. Arm & Hammer, the American oil tycoon, spent almost $1 billion developing the Piper field. This was the kind of business Margaret Thatcher could get behind.
Dr. Hammer plans to invest in Britain's future by investing a further $1.5 billion, got the billion?
Yes.
Dollars, right.
The oil business, with its big bucks, was a flagship for the free market. Nationalised industries like coal mining stood for everything that Mrs. Thatcher opposed. She was determined to close uneconomic pits. But the National Union of Mine Workers were having none of it.
The men were settling in for a strike even before they heard that their pit was to be shut. In
1981, strikes forced the government into an embarrassing retreat. Bringing the free market to the coal industry would have to wait. Instead, the government now turned its sights on the one part of the oil industry that was state-owned. The British National Oil Corporation, BNOC, had been set up by Tony Benn when he was Labour Energy Secretary in 1975, to give the state some control over our oil. Now, in 1981, the Tories decided to scrap it, as they began a massive programme of privatisation.
Just as in the rest of the economy, in general, private enterprise does better than nationalised industries. So there was no reason to treat oil any differently.
Of course, all of us are deeply thankful that the wealth of the North Sea started to flow. But the North Sea isn't a socialist sea, and its oil isn't socialist oil. It was found by private enterprise. It was drilled by private enterprise.
In 1981, the first thing that I did was to privatise BNOC.
The privatisation was the biggest the world had ever seen.
You won't forget to tell Sid, will you?
It was pioneering stuff. It also blazed the trail for a succession of sell-offs of other state-run industries.
What's the matter?
Oh, it was awful. Oh, I dreamt the BT share offer had closed, and I'd totally forgotten to ring my cousin Etty to remind her.
We had set out a path, and we were going to follow it, and we were not going to be deflected. The Falklands War, in a sense, chimed in with that. It was, in a sense, a rather dramatic example of resolve.
And that is increasingly the mood of Britain.
The country was no longer in retreat. The spirit of Britannia, it seemed, was alive and well. 1982 was a year of thinking big. And it was in British construction yards that BP built the largest and most expensive steel structure in the world, the Magnus oil platform. It was a model of the kind of enterprise Mrs. Thatcher hoped would save our economy.
And it's right that we should draw the world's attention to Britain's engineering skills, which parallel the achievements of the Brunels and the Stevensons of another century.
It cost BP £1,300 million, but it was under budget and completed ahead of schedule.
It's far bigger than any other North Sea platform, and it needs to be, because it's also the furthest north, and the winter weather can be savage.
Everybody was doing biggest this, most difficult that, highest capacity this. This was just a time of superlatives, you know. It was such an exciting time. I just can't even tell you.
Dennis Crane was one of the many American drillers that provided the skills to help develop the North Sea.
Everything was bigger and more costly and more unusual than the world had ever seen.
In 1983, 2 million barrels of oil a day were gushing through the North Sea pipelines.
Take time to see the wonders of the world.
To keep it pumping, a new generation of workers was having to adapt to a unique lifestyle.
The platforms were totally self-contained. Everything was brought out by supply boat or helicopter. So all of our food was brought out to us, and any entertainment in mailbags, entertainment being the operative word when we're talking about newspapers which arrived 3 days late or not at all, and films which we'd probably seen several times before.
Few cinemas can boast a full house every night, but then where else could you find such a captive audience?
You know, we had games nights, horse racing nights, quiz nights.
The snooker table on all of the platforms I was on really was an important feature. When I first started offshore, it was an all-male preserve.
By the 1980s, this all-male environment was starting to change.
Definitely had to adjust and be more like a man. You know, the language changed. Not saying I was an angel and I never swore, but I swore an awful lot when I worked offshore. There was respect between us because we did equal. You know, we weren't looking for favours as the fairer sex.
Oilfield food is famous. The staff performs to master chef standard.
There was food like you'd never seen. I mean, if you played your cards right, you could have 4 cooked meals a day, and we did. And there were cakes to be had in mid-afternoon and mid-morning, and it was just absolutely marvellous.
G. Madsen, well done, sirloin.
They didn't stint on it. It's first class.
Lots of different choices. You know, there was always chips, 2 kinds of potatoes, meat, fish, vegetarian meals, loads of sweets, which pleased me.
It was a fry-up every day, basically, for breakfast. Well, I did anyway. Well, it was as much food as you could put down your throat, basically.
But for all the company's efforts, the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off shift patterns took their toll on family life.
When Bob was working offshore, I hated it, and he hated it. So we would find that a couple of days before he was due for a crew change, we'd both start to get quite miserable. And then I would find the time he was away interminable.
I don't think there's any industry with a higher population of broken marriages. Communication was so difficult. You were reliant on the operator, A, allowing you to have a phone call, and B, telling you when that phone call was going to be.
I think it was much worse for families. You know, women with children, for example, and something goes wrong and, well, there's no husband to help out. You've got to do it yourself.
The kids would get used to having me, for example, saying, oh no, this is what we're going to do and you'll do it my way. And then Dad arrives and he wants to do things differently, and that's where sometimes the conflict is taking place. And I think, and I only can talk from my personal point of view, sometimes alcohol was around because that's a way of folk being able to, for people having to get used to being back on shore again.
The solution for many becomes bottled oblivion during shore leave in Aberdeen. It's a sad reflection on Aberdeen's new prosperity that with the high wages and full employment has come a sharp rise in alcoholism.
Across Britain, a credit boom was making many people feel rich. Home ownership was on the rise, and conspicuous consumption was back in fashion. Offshore workers with more money than most were enjoying the spirit of the times.
I had the view offshore that you couldn't take life too seriously, you know what I mean? And if you injected a bit of fun, then your day went quicker and it was easier to get through the trip.
We were always up to pranks, and I'm afraid I was known for quite a few of them. When I was on night shift, I would wake up particular people by throwing pails of water over them.
Horseplay, I think the employers call it now, and it's frowned upon now, unfortunately. But back then, everything from joke shop type tricks, you know, with exploding cigars and cigarettes.
I can remember a young lad come out on his first trip offshore, and it came for time to go to bed, and some of the guys says to him, now Eric, you've got to go to bed and you've got to wear your life jacket when you go to bed. So the poor lad, on this huge bulky life jacket, trying to climb into his bunk with it.
But it wasn't all fun and games. There was a strict hierarchy on the platforms. Although workers shared the same space, they didn't share the same employer or the same working conditions. Oil companies owned the North Sea fields. But contractors did much of the work. Everything from drilling to catering was farmed out to specialist companies. Contract workers didn't enjoy the same status as oil company employees.
You know, I was a contractor. I didn't work for the oil company. I worked for a contracting company, which meant there was a degree of them and us. The oil company people had a better class, shall we say, of accommodation.
There were different levels of accommodation. There was the bottom level. For us, that was called Skid Row, and that's where the drillers and the oily people lived.
Some of the rooms were 2 to a room, some were 4. Communal showers. There wasn't a shower in your room. It was pretty basic.
And then the catering was the next level. So that's kind of the pecking order as well of how you're placed offshore. And then there were construction crew. And then there were the company men.
Almost like a class system that exists between people who worked for the oil operators and people who were contractors.
Let this one down a little bit. Pick that one up.
And on many platforms, if you were a contractor, you'd get inferior accommodation. You'd get inferior food. You'd be segregated. It was almost like, on occasions, like an offshore apartheid.
There was even a separate queue for the ride home.
One of the things that was a bone of contention was the fact that when it was came time to get home, you went to the back of the queue.
That made you feel angry. You know, you're out there trying to earn just the same as everybody else is, and you're being treated completely differently, simply because of who your employer was. We were all exposed to the same hazards, the same risks.
Back on shore, the government were now encouraging contract work in other industries. Everyone from construction workers to hospital cleaners found their jobs contracted out to private companies. Some jobs were better paid than others, but the risks were exceptional. The most dangerous job offshore was that of the commercial diver. In the 70s, nearly half of all North Sea fatalities were divers. In 1974, 9 died. They were needed for maintenance, safety inspections and construction work. The North Sea was a tough place for any diver.
You've got another minute left, Drew, OK?
You're with a group of young people, you're doing what most people would regard as the impossible. There's extraordinary comradeship which builds up on diving teams. And you know that you're kind of special, really. You know it. And it makes you feel good. And so there was always a natural propensity to make light of the dangers that you'd be facing every day.
Divers routinely worked at depths of up to 150 metres. To get back to the surface safely meant hours in a decompression chamber. It was an expensive business. To improve productivity, divers were kept in pressurised tanks for weeks at a time, a technique called saturation diving.
When you're a saturation diver, what you're doing is you're living inside a big tin can. And it's pressurised, perhaps at an equivalent pressure of 150 metres of seawater. It's got bunk beds inside and the locks that enable food and clothing to be transferred in and out. And then what you do to go to your workplace is you get into what amounts to a pressurised lift, which is the diving bell. And the diving bell will go up and down from the work site, which is obviously at the bottom of the sea or halfway up one of the platforms.
Diving like this causes the blood to become saturated with gases. If the divers come back to the surface too fast, these gases can cause the bends.
It would be the equivalent of what happened in a bottle of champagne. An open bottle of champagne, if you shake it, all that gas that is dissolved would come out of solution, and suddenly your blood would bubble.
And depending on how many bubbles and where they lodge, it can either be a rash in its least extreme form, or completely fatal with bubbles forming in your brain, for example.
5 divers, 3 of them British, have been killed in an accident on a North Sea drilling rig. 4 of the victims had been in a diving bell brought up from the seabed because of storm warnings. The bell was being clamped to a decompression chamber when there was a sudden loss of pressure. The men inside died instantly.
I have to say it is not a job that I would have done out of choice. They were spending 30 to 40 days in saturation then, earning huge amounts of money, and boy did they deserve it, doing a job which to me was probably the most dangerous job in the entire North Sea. Well, in fact, in the entire industry.
There's a little bit of madness, I think, inside all the people who worked in that environment.
Most of them were pretty young. They were in it for the money, you know, and they made a lot of money. I mean, I know one guy who actually walked off the ship and within a few hours came back with a brand spanking new Porsche. I mean, these were wealthy lads.
Divers had a reputation of being a breed apart. They developed a macho, competitive culture. They could be easily exploited in a contract-driven industry.
You somehow get off on the fact that nobody else can do this kind of thing, and it's kind of cool, and you like getting your job done. But you can, then if you have that propensity inside you can be pushed into places where you just shouldn't be pushed. And in the 1980s, the system and the companies allowed that.
Many offshore workers wanted a trade union agreement. They argued it would help to make them safer. But the oil companies were anti-union, and anyone involved in union activity could find themselves with a one-way ticket home.
From day one of the industry, the American drillers, coming from a non-union, kick-ass type approach, resisted any move for trade unions to get active or involved in any way offshore.
We come from a tradition that's not unionized, so we didn't expect it. It wasn't a part of our structure. We didn't feel any pressure to unionize in those days.
They were, abhorrent, the idea of having unions involved in a platform when there was this incredible rush to get the oil out of the ground.
Now, what about unions on the rigs?
We can work things out ourselves here without the unions.
At that stage, the unions were very strong in Britain. Obviously, the union management wanted to get a lot of influence offshore, but most of the workers at that time were pretty glad to be paid what was generous wages for working offshore, and they just wanted to get on with the job.
I just couldn't do my job. I would have to have another crew. It's as simple as that. And I think everyone here, we work as a team, and that's how we handle it. If any of these lads have got a grievance, they come to me. If I can't handle it, I'll put them to the toll pusher.
There was a feeling that they wouldn't gain much out of having the union alongside the sort of standard wages that were being paid in Britain. They were very highly paid jobs. And so there was this feeling, well, what do we need a union for?
I've worked in the car factories myself. I know what unions are. I was actually a union member at one time. And no, never again.
But onshore, the government was making another attempt to close uneconomic coal mines. The National Union of Mine Workers were determined to stop the closures.
If we remain united, not only will we never be defeated, but in the process, we'll roll back the years of Thatcherism.
The strike-free oil industry was a Thatcher dream. But some oil workers were starting to want their own unions.
By the beginning of the 80s, we could see wage stagnation, and certainly by the middle of the 80s, wage cuts. And those wage cuts were caused primarily by this competitive tendering process, where a contractor would undercut the contractor next door. And the only thing they had to bargain with was our paying conditions.
But any attempts to organise were strongly resisted by the oil companies.
The very mention the word union would see you run off. And that was where the term NRB came. It was not required back. Your employer would receive a letter, because the vast majority of us were contractors. Your employer would receive a letter from the oil company saying that you, as an individual, were no longer required on their installation. So you did everything you could not to upset the oil company, the client.
Because we're all written down on the same list. It's like that. What? And that's the one.
The fear of being sacked stifled any possibility of an offshore oil workers' union. And onshore in March 1985, the powerful NUM was defeated. The government got its way, and the strike was defeated. There seemed no limit to the oil industry's ambitions. High oil prices were encouraging them to find new ways of getting oil from deeper and deeper waters. One company was about to attempt a daring technical experiment. If it was successful, it would make drilling in deep oceans possible for the first time.
Nothing like this has ever been attempted before. Nothing has so captured the imagination in the quest for offshore oil.
Marine control, go ahead, C1. Preparation.
Companies, including my own, including Conoco, for some time had been realizing that water depths were going to get deeper and deeper where oil was discovered, and that this was the real frontier for the oil companies to work at. And they looked at various models of floating platforms. And one of those was known as the tension leg platform.
Unlike fixed structures, the tension leg platform, or TLP, has legs which tether the floating production platform to the seabed. These legs are anchored down under tension to the foundations, piled into the bedrock.
The tension legs are maintained in tension by the fact that the platform has more buoyancy than it has weight. And the behavior of the platform then is much like an upside-down pendulum. It can sway backwards and forwards, but it's constrained from moving vertically.
If they could make this one work, the new frontier of deep water exploration would be opened up, but it was far from certain. Jeff Tetlow was one of the leading engineers on the tension leg platform.
We started the TLP project believing that all of the technology had been proven, that we simply had to apply it. But about 12 months into the project, I went through a serious state of believing that maybe the technology we were trying to develop simply wouldn't work and that we would have to walk away from it.
They started building in 1982. 3,500 workers laboured to transform the revolutionary design into reality.
Here we are in December '83, and we've still got about 1.7 million man-hours to go. We're currently scheduled to leave here in May 1984.
Whilst the hull was being built at Nig, the superstructure was being built at Ardeshir.
I think it's very, very impressive. It's big and it's massive. It's just oozing with technology, as you can see. It says I'm Mr. Technology out there. It is a feat, no question about it.
With the anchor lines blasted away, the hull is now free for the tow-out.
We're absolutely delighted that we're here, about to go out tonight, a day ahead of time, which even a few weeks ago, people were doubtful as to whether we would go out on the 11th of May, and now we're going to show them all and go out on the 10th of May.
When we flooded the dock and took the hull out, it was a tremendous feeling of success to get to that stage.
May the 12th, perfect morning and a perfectly timed operation as the deck is floated delicately into place.
Control room, this is drilling. Yep.
Officially right now, HO112 is turned over to production.
The world's first tension leg platform comes on stream.
Just a little bit thicker than petrol. Lovely smell.
The development of the Hutton tension leg platform was a turning point for the industry. It proved that it was possible to develop oil fields in deeper waters than had ever been thought. Whole new oil territories were suddenly within our grasp. The offshore oil industry's growth seemed unstoppable. In 1985, oil production soared to its highest ever level. Just 1 year later, boom turned to bust. The global economy tipped into recession and demand for oil slowed. Oil companies' incomes were slashed.
This year's oil price collapse from $29 a barrel in January to just $14 now has had a dramatic effect on new exploration and development. Without an increase in the oil price soon, the experts tell us that thousands of North Sea jobs and many companies may be lost for good.
The oil price collapse of 1986 was obviously a real problem for the North Sea oil industry.
One of the biggest problems of that 1986 collapse in the oil price was that it put a big question mark over all future projects.
The exploration rigs are the high-risk gambles of the North Sea. They can either strike it rich or soak up $15,000 a day drilling a dry hole into the seabed. Already there's been a series of company collapses, defensive mergers and amalgamations as the search for oil for the 1990s is curtailed by the current price collapse.
Suddenly the oil companies were saying, no, we're putting that one on hold. No, we won't go drilling just yet.
For a reminder of what went wrong are the rows of drilling rigs idle in Scottish firths. It costs $3,000 a day just to keep installations on board ticking over.
I think one time I went up and there must have been about 40 rigs just sitting in the Cromarty Firth. You'd come round the corner, you know, lovely Black Isle and everything else. You'd come up and there would be nothing but redundant rigs sitting there.
The industry was very prone to the peaks and troughs, and the first thing to be hit every single time was the workforce. There would be downmans on a regular basis, simply because the cost of oil had dropped one day, downman, a load of guys the next. So it really was a dog-eat-dog world. You were fighting for survival with your own workmates, as it were.
More than 800 jobs are at risk after the offshore oil construction firm Howard Doris called in the receiver. At the company's biggest yard in the Highlands, 600 jobs may go. It's the biggest employer left in the area.
Up to now, no, more or less go from one job into another. I just don't see it now.
The only thing I can do is to work away, which means leaving my wife and my family behind.
This year's cutback in development work has hit the oil capital of Aberdeen. All the spin-off generated by high-spending oil men is down.
Where have all the people gone?
They're all here, but they don't have money any longer to spend in entertainment.
The government often say that people who are out of work should get on their bike to go and look for a job.
I've done that for 20-odd years.
Everything got squeezed, and you could feel it. You could see it on the work sites. You had a sense of everything being tight. You could see, just by the quality of materials in the storeroom, that everything was on ration.
There were swinging cutbacks. Maintenance schedules were cut back. Engineers and maintenance personnel were paid off by the thousand.
It created an atmosphere of, an oppressive atmosphere where you knew that the pressure was on to get things done quickly and cheaply.
With the price of crude plummeting, oil operators tightened their belts. But further south, the city was awash with money. The Big Bang, the radical deregulation of the financial markets, was making London the hottest financial centre in the world as banking became the driving force of the economy.
Take 10 million!
While yuppies spent their cash, the oil industry counted the cost of the price collapse. This was the worst year for offshore oil workers since the industry began. It was about to get worse.
It was the 6th of November 1986, and it was in the morning, and we got a call in the Aberdeen newsroom that a helicopter had crashed off Shetland. Now, there were a lot of helicopter crashes in the early days. Some people survived, some of them miraculously. We learned very early on that this was a Chinook.
The Chinook was on its way from the Brent oil field to Shetland when it hit the sea without any warning. It was only minutes away from landing at Shetland's main airport.
I was dispatched up to Shetland, flown up there, by which time we knew that it had been a catastrophic accident of some kind with this helicopter. There were early reports that there were no survivors. By the time we got there, we learned that 45 men had died and that 2 had survived. What happened to the giant Chinook is a mystery. There was no Mayday call, no radio warning of the worst civilian helicopter disaster in the Western world. She was found almost by chance. The Coast Guard helicopter based here at Sunborough was 5 minutes into a routine flight. The pilot saw an oil slick and wreckage. He saw only small pieces of wreckage, 1 wheel and 2 survivors.
You know, the Chinook has these 2 things, and it has a design in it that prevents because they overlap, and it has a design that prevents them from actually clashing. And this ring failed, and the propellers clashed. And it just went down like a stone.
As light faded, along with the hope of finding any more survivors, the helicopters returned, leaving the boats to keep looking.
Certainly a traumatic experience, and I went to a lot of funerals very shortly after that.
This tragic accident put labour relations to the test as never before.
Even the shell guys, even those guys who would never normally get involved in any sort of anti-company position or stance, got involved in this because they hated the Chinook.
And most of the oil companies, which was, I think, the first time I can remember, and one of the very few times I can remember, the oil companies bowing, as it were, to the will of their people. And because their staff weren't happy flying in them, they didn't make them fly in them. So the Chinooks never flew again in the North Sea.
Despite the human tragedy and financial turmoil of 1986, oil output scarcely faltered.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume, pump up the volume, dance, dance.
The attitude of the industry was business as usual. They just had to find cheaper ways of doing it. One platform in particular was the flag bearer for the industry, Piper Alpha. It was one of the world's most prolific oil platforms, and in 1988 was producing 10% of Britain's oil output. It was operated by Occidental, part of Armand Hammer's business empire.
Dr. Hammer estimates that his firm alone has invested $2 billion in the North Sea.
Now that's news. You can make lineage on that.
Though things don't always work out as planned in this high-risk business.
110 miles off the coast of Aberdeen, Piper Alpha was a giant industrial complex with sleeping quarters, a cinema, restaurant and gymnasium. It was the hub for a network of platforms. Piper Alpha acted as the receiving and pumping station not only for oil, but also for gas, which were pumped to the mainland. Ed Punchard was coordinating the diving activities on Piper.
Piper had had a torrid history of accident, injury and death.
Pat Ballantyne's husband was an electrician on the platform.
There were a whole lot of things that were wrong with the actual rig, but nobody dared talk about them.
Piper had this reputation for being a dangerous place.
I was constantly anxious when Bob was offshore, and I would read everything I could get my hands on, and every night I made it it became an obsession, I think, to stay up and watch the last news bulletin on the local Grampian channel. And as long as there was nothing on this news bulletin, I could then go to bed and that would be fine.
But the 6th of July 1988 was different.
This was the only night, the whole time he worked offshore, that I did not watch the television. I did not watch the late news bulletin. And I went to bed not knowing anything. I went to bed not knowing that half an hour after, in fact less than half an hour after he'd spoken to me, the series of explosions had started and that he was actually fighting for his life.
It started when a gas condensate pump exploded. James Craig was on shift that night.
Me and my mate were working away as usual, and then there was a massive explosion.
The first that I knew that something had happened was when the ceiling landed on my head. It was an incredible instantaneous shock.
There was flames coming up through the drains.
All manner of things cascaded off walls, and of course the vast majority of the lights went out as well.
Me and my mate, we got to the door of the module, but the smoke, black, oily smoke, was everywhere. You're told if anything like that happens, you make for the helideck. But the way the wind was blowing and the density of the smoke, you couldn't get to the helideck, and no helicopter could possibly land.
I had to go up a series of stairwells to get to the muster point, but I was completely blocked by an impenetrable amount of smoke.
In spite of receiving mayday calls from Piper, the neighbouring platforms carried on pumping oil.
The entire area around the wellheads was completely ablaze. And when you see an incredibly large fire around the wellhead area, you immediately know that the problem could escalate very rapidly.
The fire stopped men reaching the lifeboats. Most of them went to the fireproofed accommodation block.
The heat melted the metal in below us, and the whole structure collapsed, just fell bodily down, and there was men obviously killed at that point. My foot got stuck between two pipes, and I managed to drag my foot out between the pipes. So we started climbing over pipes that were hot. My hands were burned and legs.
We all, I think, had a sense that we had an immediate and urgent need to get away from the platform.
The water was there, but it was about 150 feet below me. But he just jumped, just took off.
20 minutes after the first explosion, the pressurized gas pipeline melted and burst. Three tons of gas was coming out of the ruptured pipe every second, 1.5 times the entire UK gas consumption.
What we saw, of course, was an incredible fireball emerge from underneath the platform, billow out in an expanding, burning mass, hit the sea, envelop one of the rescue craft, and then bounce back up again to surround the entire platform. You could only describe Piper Alpha as being a firework, whereas the platform until this moment had been largely enveloped by smoke. From now onwards, it was completely enveloped in burning gas. It was obvious that we'd gone from an incident that might have killed 5 or 6 people to an incident that would almost certainly kill the majority of the people on the platform.
Piper Alpha's standby vessel was the Silver Pit, a converted fishing trawler. Its fast rescue craft began to pick up survivors as other vessels converged on the disaster. The Tharos, a movable platform with firefighting capabilities and a helicopter, was specially built for dealing with major emergencies.
contact with the vessel Silver Fin.
Oscar, the tower study deck is clear. Roger. You are the one with medical stuff. Affirmative.
After withstanding temperatures of up to 1,000 degrees centigrade for over an hour, the platform buckled, plunging the accommodation module into the sea with over 100 men trapped inside. Survivors were brought to Aberdeen. Of the 226 men aboard Piper Alpha, only 62 survived. The following morning, this was all that remained of the thousands of tons of steel that made up the giant Piper platform.
4 of the wells on Piper Alpha are still blazing fiercely, the fires fueled by gas and oil rushing up from below the seabed.
In the immediate 2 or 3 days after Piper, it was a constant round of trying to piece together and at the same time trying to find anybody who might be able to point of any kind of indication of what had caused this.
One of Scotland's most respected High Court judges, Lord Cullen, was appointed to lead the inquiry into the tragedy.
Mrs. Thatcher visited the survivors in hospital in Aberdeen this afternoon.
And I've seen some of them in hospital, and they're marvellous people. And we've got to look after the relatives of those who've lost people.
In the explosion, the accommodation module had crashed into the sea, and it was obvious that there were many bodies in there.
100 days after the catastrophic explosions and fires which devastated the Piper Alpha platform, its main accommodation module is finally brought to the surface of the North Sea. Little, if any, of the interior has remained intact. That will make the police search of the module even more difficult. They already carry the hopes of so many families as they try to find as many as possible of the 112 missing men.
The tragedy would also leave its mark on the survivors.
I felt a bit guilty about my pals that they didn't make it. I mean, that was the initial feeling. It was guilt.
Bob Ballantyne was amongst those airlifted to hospital. A year later, he and Bill Barron still suffer.
Bob went from being quite light-hearted, easygoing, to someone who could get furious at a moment's notice, who could become very self-absorbed. You know, the anger never actually left him.
I was living on adrenaline, and I, you know, that's just how it was for me. But there was a point when I just really hit a brick wall and effectively shut down, and I recovered from it okay, but it did happen, and it happened to quite a lot of people in the aftermath.
I think we have taken every precaution we know how. You must remember this is the first time in 12 years that we've had a casualty on any of our rigs in the North Sea.
In fact, a year before the tragedy, a rigger died on Piper Alpha as a result of a failure of safety procedures. Occidental were prosecuted, but failed to change the way they worked.
What was concerning me was, although there was an Occidental Board of Inquiry after this event, it didn't seem to me that the lessons of this had been passed through the system to those who were, so to speak, on the ground.
Just 11 days before the tragedy, Piper Alpha had been visited by a safety inspector from the Department of Energy.
What I learnt about inspection by the Department of Energy was not very encouraging. It tended to be rather superficial. And this was certainly one of the factors which led me into thinking about the future of safety in the North Sea.
While Lord Cullen pored over the evidence, the initial grief of survivors and their families turned to anger.
Angry at all these lives that had been washed out, angry at the fact that the companies had never listened to any of the complaints, angry at the way people had been treated, angry at the way people had died.
The anger found a voice in a group of activists who had been fighting for trade union recognition under the banner of the Offshore Installation Liaison Committee, or OILC.
For the first time in 10 years, offshore workers are staging strikes and sit-ins. The action spread across the North Sea, culminating, warn the organisers, in a massive stoppage tomorrow to mark the anniversary of the Piper disaster.
The Cullen Report was published 13 months later. It described Occidental's approach to safety as superficial and cited many shortcomings. It made 106 recommendations, including a new safety regime for the entire industry. The Piper Alpha tragedy spurred the oil industry to fit new safety valves on key oil and gas pipelines. To do so, they would have to shut down many of the platforms in the North Sea at a cost of over £1.5 billion. The OILC saw its chance.
Our strategy was to allow the shutting down of the platforms, and when all the infrastructure was dead, and we would simply take industrial action to make sure that the platforms never started up again until consideration was given of our aspiration for a trade union agreement in the offshore oil and gas industry.
Organisers of the unofficial action say support is strong and still spreading.
Workers are sitting it out on 6 rigs in support of their claim for union recognition and a say on safety issues.
Communication was difficult with other installations and with other fields. We started hearing that it was escalating, that people were starting to sit in or take action for certain periods.
The men say it's in support of union recognition and improved safety standards. The employers say the safety issue is a red herring. The action is really a union bid for power.
The conditions the men are after is an industrial relations package which will give them protection in the future from the instant dismissal and Stone Age industrial relations practices that have been prevalent out in the North Sea for the last 10 years. So the maltreatment of the 80s was no longer an option. And also to convince the workforce that they didn't need trade unions. The contractors and oil companies had to make sure that from 1990 onwards, every year, there were reasonably attractive pay rises and enhancements of terms and conditions.
The industry placated offshore workers with better wages and conditions, but OILC never achieved across-the-board union recognition. The cost of the industrial action was high. Around 1,000 contract workers were sacked and blacklisted. The strikes cost the operators £200 million.
A year after the tragedy, the last visible landmark of it stands no longer. But its lessons will be learned for years. On one issue, all sides are united, that 167 men shouldn't have died in vain.
It was a sombre end to a tumultuous decade. Within months, Mrs. Thatcher would be defeated. The city would be rocked by the collapse of the pound. And Britain's North Sea adventurers would face a new challenge in a world whose thirst for oil seemed unquenchable.